Welcome back. The war in Ukraine has brought about a dramatic shift in Germany, not only in its attitudes towards Russia, but on what it's now prepared to spend on its own defence. Some weeks ago, the German government was sending Ukraine helmets. Today, according to the German defence minister, they're now the second biggest supplier of arms. But is Europe ready? Are the German people ready for their country to assume its position as one of the world's leading military powers? Chancellor Scholz says his country will now spend 2% of its GDP on defence, in line with the NATO target. That would amount to some $80 billion. It would make Germany the world's third largest spender on defence. Dr. Toby Greene from Bayern University has been looking into the implications of Germany's new position on military spending. Welcome to the programme. Well, let me ask you, are the German people ready for this?
Well, I think that's a really very good question. When Chancellor Scholz made that speech in the Bundestag, I think it was broadly welcomed by the parliamentarians across quite a broad spectrum, but also greeted with some degree of shock. But I think you asked the right question when you talk about the German public, because German political culture, German society has been very reticent about the use of force. That's the sort of position that its leadership have wanted to take in the years following the Second World War. And it's one thing to spend a lot of money on defense, but if the society doesn't have the will or the political culture behind it, or the commitment or the will to use that kind of military force, then that's another thing entirely. And I think that in an age where Europeans are increasingly uncertain about where the United States may stand in future conflicts, then that's one of the motivations why Chancellor Scholz and other European leaders want to be more self-sufficient in defence. But again, it's not just about spending the money. It's, does the country have the ability, the commitment, the will to credibly wield that kind of military power?
Well, that's a very good point, isn't it? I mean, whatever the people think about it, you've got to have a will within government circles as well. If you have a growing military capability, there is increasing pressure to wield it. And the instinct has been, when we saw this in the fight against Islamic State, has been to hang back and to be almost a retreating partner in the alliance. Do you see that ever changing with Germany leading from the front?
I don't think it can change overnight. You're right. In the campaign against Daesh, for example, it tends to be German contribution tends to be more in the kind of reconnaissance sort of roles and fairly modest in its contribution. And that will have to change if Germany indeed wants to be able to position itself as a credible military force, able to stand by its NATO allies. And of course, the need to stand by its NATO allies credibly is, of course, all the more important, as we've seen in the last month. Then that political culture will have to change, but it won't change overnight. The equipment that Germany would need, even if it has the money to spend, the German forces can't be turned into a stronger, more credible military force. But again, and that political culture cannot change overnight. But I do believe even if Germany is successful in developing the actual credible military forces, then the pressure will build from its European allies to be the one to take a leadership role. But that's something that runs against a lot of the way that German leaders have sought to position their country in the decades since the Second World War. And so a lot does indeed have to change for that military commitment to be meaningful.
Dr. Greene, stay with us. Let me bring you in on this, Lord Ricketts, because I know this is something that you've taken an awful lot of interest in, particularly when you were former ambassador in Paris. Henry Kissinger once said the German problem is that throughout much of history, Germany has been either too weak or too strong for the peace of Europe. But the importance of harnessing German power at this point, when we've just had 4 years of Donald Trump and we have a war on the eastern flank of Europe, really does come front and centre again.
Yes, it really does. I mean, the two Germanys, of course, were at the epicenter of the Cold War. And after 1989, Western Germany decided that it was really going to check out of the defence and security business, concentrate on economic growth, on negotiation, on dialogue, and leave it to people like the British and the French and the Americans to do the hard security and to invest in defence. And that was what a generation of Germans felt comfortable with, strong pacifist streak. And that cannot change overnight, absolutely. I think what Chancellor Scholz has done is a stunning transformation. I mean, at least he's now proposing $100 billion worth of down payment on modernising the Bundeswehr, which had been allowed to become extremely outmoded, badly maintained, a lot of equipment not working. And he now has a vision of Germany becoming a player in the strategic and defense world. But yes, the culture in Germany has to follow that as well. It can't be done overnight. It's going to take years before money turns into real military capability. And there's got to be a change in the way German people look at themselves and their role in the world. It'll be very welcome in France. I think the French have been looking for a strong European partner in defense for a long time. I hope Britain can build the same sort of close defense relationship with Germany as we've had with France rather successfully.
Like a Lancaster House Agreement, something like that.
The Lancaster House Agreement we signed in 2010 was a big strategic compact with the French on defense. If Germany is going to make this transformation, we ought to be in there shaping the way they do it so it works with NATO, as well as potentially giving Europe more capability against the day when we have, again, somebody in the White House who is no longer trustworthy on NATO.
Reena, you said that there are some people in Washington who have collective amnesia about the last 4 years. Well, they don't have collective amnesia over here. They remember, particularly in Paris, the threats, the way that Donald Trump undermined the Article 5 agreement within NATO, and that is why Emmanuel Macron has been pushing the Germans to spend more on defence.
I say welcome Germany to the military chat. This is good news for the United States. I think obviously there's a real tip to the hat on speaking about culture and what countries believe should be the culture of how military is spent on. I mean, here in the United States, for example, most of the change in attitudes about U.S. defense spending, for example, or the strength of the U.S. military is driven by Republicans. And, you look at Democrats, their opinions on defense spending have mostly been stable, although there's been a slight decline in the percentage in a group that was polled in the past couple of years about how is the U.S. spending too much on defense, for example. But really, the most marked figure here I think is interesting is that more independents now than in 2020 say that the U.S. is spending too little on defense, and with most of that increase being offset by a decline in the percentage saying that the U.S. spends too much. So that's according to Gallup here in the United States. And I think it's very interesting data that tells us again that Republicans are not defining the culture anymore entirely, and that's good news as we look at our allies globally as to how we handle this this military spending, because there are domestically here shifting attitudes and a sense that the U.S. no longer needs to be alone on the world stage, although we have enjoyed great support from our allies there in Britain.
I want to talk about these European concerns because President Biden has said in recent weeks there is great unity in NATO. Senator Mitt Romney said today that he feels that that if Donald Trump was re-elected for another 4 years, that would pose real problems for NATO and for that NATO unity going forward. So let's bring in from Capitol Hill Suzanne Kienpour, because she's been out to speak to Mitt Romney, our Access All Areas correspondent up there on the Hill. You've been back to quiz him about this. And what did he say specifically, Suzanne, about America's commitment to NATO going forward?
So during Donald Trump's presidency, President Macron's concerns for Europe's security were high, and that's because he saw an indifference towards NATO from Donald Trump. In an interview with U.S. media earlier, Senator Mitt Romney said that he would understand why the world would be concerned about the future of NATO if Donald Trump were to be reelected in 2024. Now, I asked him today, how can he reassure European allies that the U.S.-NATO alliance will indeed remain strong regardless of who is in the White House? And this is what he had to say.
Well, one of the things that happened today, in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was a vote almost unanimous to say that no president can withdraw from NATO without the approval of Congress, and that would never occur. There is full commitment on the part of the United States Congress to the mission of NATO, to our commitment to our fellow NATO members, and our commitment to honoring all of our requirements underneath that agreement.
That is really interesting, isn't it? That suggests then that there is within the Senate, Suzanne, a determination to give some sort of guarantee to the Europeans.
Yes, exactly. On this program yesterday, Colonel Alex Vindman told you that it was some of the positions of the last administration that led to the Ukraine war that we're seeing today. And when I asked Senator Romney about this, he said that this move that they've made in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee today shows a strong commitment moving forward towards NATO and sends what he said a strong message to Putin and other what he called would-be tyrants.
What do you make of that, Lord Ricketts? Is that the sort of assurance that the Europeans would be looking for, a vote on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee?
I think it's very helpful, but I think what Donald Trump said, open questioning of the US commitment to NATO, shook not just the French but the Germans very deeply, and other Europeans as well. Of course, we want to feel that the US Congress would stand behind NATO, but I think this already set the tectonic plates shifting, and a more interest in Europe in what is called strategic autonomy, Europe being able to stand on its own 2 feet in defense, but also in technology and security. And I don't think that will change. I think part of the German move will be to reinforce that. Of course, it's good news to hear that the US Congress wouldn't allow a rapid and ill thought out American withdrawal from NATO, which would be catastrophic. But I think the doubts have been sown and they won't entirely go away.
We talked about the change in mentality, Dr. Greene. The very fact that Germany is now looking at Israel where you are for a missile defence system, they are really shaken by some of the sabre rattling they've seen in Moscow over recent weeks, and they really do take their own defence seriously now in a way that they didn't perhaps 4 weeks ago.
Sure, and I think although European leaders will no doubt be pleased to hear the kind of political moves on Capitol Hill that we've just heard about, they nonetheless may have to get used to a world where you pick up the phone to the White House and nobody may answer the phone, or the person that answers the phone may not be very interested in what you have to say or in your concerns, regardless of where the Capitol Hill may stand. So I don't think it'll just be Germany. I think it'll be many European states that are looking to expand their defense budgets, that will be looking to improve their capabilities. Israel is one source of military capabilities with strengths in particular fields, including missile defense, including drones, including cyber. So it won't only be Germany, I think, that will be looking to acquire weapons from Israel and other places. It'll be many other European countries at the same time.
Is there a danger, Rena, that with this renewed focus on defence and maybe a Cold War starting and who knows, the Russians with a footprint in Ukraine going forward, that actually the American presence in Europe will be much bigger, a reversal of what we've seen in recent years?
Oh, goodness, Christian. Well, I hope it's not your lips to the Lord's ears, it's and not Lord Ricketts here. We're really hoping on globally that we do not see this escalation and need to see the U.S. military involved, obviously. But there are people who know, people who have been victims of Putin's brutality and of his regime that certainly wish we would agree with Zelensky here. I think, again, go back to American public opinion. Historically, American attitudes about defense and the military have varied according to current U.S. policy and international and domestic events. So let's just see. So far, the U.S. military is not involved, and I just hope it doesn't get to that. But I also want to see this invasion come to an end. So it's really hard to tell what American public opinion will shift to in the coming weeks. Let's just hang tight and hope this does not get worse.
Okay, well, Suzanne Kimanpour on the Hill, thank you very much indeed for that. Some news there that the Foreign Relations Committee is committing the United States to NATO. And thank you also, Dr. Toby Greene, for your thoughts on Germany and the spending that we're likely to see over the coming years.